Thanks to everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. Pleased to be with you as well. As some of you may know, I've written 12 books on Canada's two world wars, about half of them on the First World War, and all of those books have touched on Currie in significant detail, including one of which is a biography of Sir Arthur Currie, a joint biography. And despite 25 years of research and writing about the Canadian Corps and the Canadian Expeditionary Force and Sir Arthur Currie, he remains a difficult man to know. He was a Canadian hero to many Canadians of the day, and yet to some, including some of his own soldiers, he was accused of being a murderer of his own troops. He was a general who understood that wars are won by killing. And yet after the war, he was part of a peace movement. And he was a post-war university administrator who built and nurtured. I tried to come to grips with him in my book, The Madman and the Butcher, but he remains an elusive figure. So I hope to tell you a bit about him today in about half an hour or so. I'll start with a bit of a backstory on Currie, but I want to focus on his post-Vimy role within the Canadian Corps. You can see some rare photographs of him from about 1912, 1913 here. He was born in December of 1875. He was a tall man, you can see here. Even in youth, he was nicknamed Big Art. And Big Art grew up in rural Ontario near London, Ontario, which is about 2 hours west of Toronto, to help some of you with the geography there. He had a fairly undistinguished life in rural Ontario. He was smart, he was athletic, he was willful, and yet he didn't have much of a future. He dabbled with teaching, he never went to university, which was remarked upon after the war when he became a university administrator, in effect the principal of McGill University. And he was generally unhappy. And around his 18th birthday, he moved west. He crossed the country to Victoria, and that's where he grew up. And he became a successful businessman, really through land development. And a respected member of Victorian society. And as part of that, it was his role in the militia. He had joined the militia in 1897. He was a gunner, and he always understood the importance of artillery, eventually rising to become a lieutenant colonel of a regiment. But even in that grand capacity, he only commanded about 400 soldiers. And they were part-time soldiers. They were citizen soldiers, as was Sir Arthur Currie. He devoted the time to them. He spent about 150 days a year at the armory. I examined his diaries from that period and was surprised at how often he was out on the firing range or involved first with his artillery battery and then later an infantry regiment. And he was a busy man. Perhaps too busy, because he missed the signs in the market around 1913, after about 15 years of prosperity, that the housing market was going to collapse. And it's interesting that today in Canada, housing markets, the prices have gone through the roof, and there's a continual talk about the bubble bursting. Well, this is what happened in 1913. And Arthur Currie was caught with all of these inflated properties that he had bought for $10,000 and that were now worth $2,000. And so he was close to being bankrupt when the war broke out in August of 1914. He was 38 years old. He talked about feeling the duty to serve overseas. He was a recognized Canadian militia officer. And yet he really worried about his finances. Like so many Canadians, so many British, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, Dominion, those who often enlisted left behind their farms, their businesses, and didn't know what was going to happen to them. And that was Currie's issue as well. But he was asked and then pressured, in fact, by the Minister of Militia and Defense, Sam Hughes. And you can see Sam here on my left, and Arthur is on the right with the plumed hat. The minister asked Currie to do his duty, and he did. He enlisted. And so Currie enlisted from August of 1914 and would serve the entire war. He had a reputation, and why Sam Hughes wanted him was he had a reputation of being an excellent trainer of men. But he had no command experience. He had not served in the South African War, for instance. He had been too sick. He was plagued by a stomach ailment his whole life. And now he was chosen to command one of the 4 Canadian infantry brigades of 4,000 soldiers, about 10 times the number he commanded in peacetime. And in one of his letters in the archives, and his Currie's archival papers are spread across the country, which makes it difficult to research. Some are in Victoria, some are at the National Archives, some are at the War Museum, where I work, the Canadian War Museum. Others are at McGill, others are spread in other archival repositories. But in one letter he wrote, "I doubted myself. I doubted myself." Now, he had read the infantry manuals, but he continued in that letter that he had learned a lot from the books, but he had never experienced it firsthand. And he wrote, "I had to find out for myself and master it if I could. And master it if I could." There's self-doubt there. And I think that's important to know. He occasionally doubted himself, but he was the type of man to put himself to the task. He was not sure he was ready to command a brigade, but then, of course, this was an army that was created from scratch. Canada's professional force was only about 3,000 soldiers, and Sam Hughes, the Minister of Militia and Defense, in fact, the Defense Minister, hated the permanent force. He thought they were useless. And so he really wanted most of the citizen soldiers, men like Currie, to enlist and to serve overseas. And I think that's interesting, that Currie, from the start, is selected by Sam Hughes, because later, I'll just give away a bit of the story here, it'll be Sam Hughes that will attack him relentlessly over a number of issues. Currie went overseas with the first contingent, and they arrived in Salisbury Plain in October of 1914 in that very wet, cold winter. And almost immediately, the Canadian commander, which was a British commander, E.A.H. Alderson, seen here with that fantastic mustache, he understood that Currie was, and he wrote in a letter, "Currie is out and out the best. The best." And he was comparing him to the other Canadian commanders. So even in the very difficult winter, and you can see the muddy conditions there, Currie excelled. And yet, of course, he and his soldiers had not yet been tested in battle. Where Currie learned and where his trial of fire was at the Battle of Second EAP in April of 1915. This is a very famous painting by Richard Jack. It's about 22 feet long and maybe 14 feet high. So this image doesn't quite do justice to it. It was painted a year after the battle as well. But those of you who know the battle will remember that it was where the Germans unleashed chlorine gas for the first time, and where the Canadian division was engaged in 4 brutal days of warfare and fighting, with 2 French divisions collapsing to the north of them in the face of the first gas attack on the 22nd, and the Canadians attacking, counterattacking, facing another gas attack on the 24th. And eventually being pushed back, but really playing a key role there. And they paid for that. They paid for it with 6,000 casualties. Those of you who have been to the Western Front, as I imagine many of you have, know of the brooding soldier that marks the Canadian stand at Second EAP. Costly with 6,000 casualties. Currie had fought a good battle. There was a lot of confusion and chaos. But Currie generally emerged from that battle having done fairly well, although all of the Canadians were pushed to the limit there, and Currie had made some mistakes. And I can maybe come back to that in the question period if you want to talk about that. Currie and the survivors went forward through the summer of 1915, and in September of 1915, the Canadian Corps was formed, 4 divisions strong at Vimy. At this point, it was only 2 divisions strong. but Currie was given the 1st Division, the most senior division. And the British Army commander, Sir Henry Horne, said of him, dogged, dependable, thorough, and increasingly knowledgeable. Currie is unquestionably the most senior, ablest senior officer the Canadian Corps has produced. So he continued to really prove, I think, to other officers, senior officers, British and Canadian, that he was learning his craft, moving from a brigadier commanding 4,000 now to commanding an infantry division of over 18,000, including gunners and machine gunners, medical units, engineers, support units as well. Currie was a good learner. He was a good listener as well. One of the things I found was that he had experienced British staff officers. And while Currie was a Canadian national, a nationalist at heart, and understood that the Canadian Corps was a nationalizing force that would help to distinguish Canada, he also understood that the Canadians couldn't do it alone. They relied very heavily upon imperial officers, and that would continue throughout the war, even though the Canadians went through a Canadianization period. Currie was also a firm disciplinarian. He had been before the war with his militia experience, and he continued that in this war. He held fierce inspections. He demanded salutes. He invoked group punishments. And these, he thought, were essential in forging the Canadians into an effective fighting force. And I think they were. The problem was that the Canadian soldiers themselves resisted this type of discipline. And the Canadians, like the Australians, had a reputation of being better brawlers than soldiers and pushing back against discipline. And they really helped to distinguish themselves. This idea of these northern warriors forged in the Arctic snow, born with a rifle in hand, hunting polar bears by the age of 3. It was all nonsense, of course, but that was part of the constructed image of the Canadian soldier. And the pushback against discipline was a part of that. And so the Canadian soldier rarely came to love Sir Arthur Currie. And I'll come back to that, because I think that's something we need to understand, that Currie was never a charismatic figure. He didn't have easy ways with the soldiers that he commanded. He even had trouble showing affection to them. He was often quite gruff, and his sympathy was not on display. And some of the other officers who did love him, his other divisional commanders, brigadiers, those who knew and understood and respected his skill, both as a brigadier and then a major general and then as a lieutenant general as command of the Corps, noted that this was a fault. It was a fault that he didn't have an easy way in talking to the soldiers. That doesn't mean he didn't care for them. His archives are full of letters to grieving mothers and parents. He wrote handwritten letters. He wrote about weeping and over the casualties. He wrote about the strain of sending men into battle, the weight of command. He bore it, and yet he was not able to convey that sympathy to the other, to his soldiers. And I think that's important for us to think about. We know there are different command styles in the Great War. Sir Douglas Haig as a silent, gruff, a stately general, some of the army commanders with a different style. The Canadians with Sir Julian Byng, seen here as the right. Byng had a very loose style with the Canadians, and they loved him for it, and they talked about it. They even called themselves Byng's boys. And yet Currie, the Canadian, had a very different style. Speaking of Byng, Byng and Currie got along. When Byng took over the Canadian Corps in late May of 1916, after Alderson had been undermined by Sam Hughes and pushed aside, Byng relied on Currie to help him during the Battle of Montserrat in June of 1916, and relied on him during the Somme battles as well. one of the important things I think to recognize is that Currie was tagged by Sir Julian Byng to study some of the lessons of the Somme and to instigate some high-level reforms. Now, they were carried out by Byng, as was a command of the Corps at Vimy. And I only want to point that out again because there is a long-standing error in Canadian history, and I wrote about this in my book on Vimy Ridge, that often it is thought that Currie was the commander at Vimy. And I'm a lack of a better term, a TV historian to some degree. I've done hundreds of TV interviews. I must have been asked 20, 30 times over the last 20 years, tell me about Currie at Vimy and how he won the battle. And I always have to disappoint the journalist and say, it wasn't Currie, it was Byng of Vimy. He took that as his title. He was the commander. And I've always wondered why it was. There was an error printed in an early textbook, but that can't be the full reason why so many Canadians think Currie commanded at Vimy. It partially has to do with the lack of knowledge about the First World War, even though it's fairly well known in Canada to some of those information. But I think it is partially that Vimy is such an important icon, a legend, as I have called it, in Canada. And this, of course, is the 104th anniversary of the capture of the Pimple. There were newspaper accounts over the last couple of days. So many people have talked about Vimy as the birth of Canada or the birth of a new nation through the First World War that they assumed that a Canadian had to be in command there. They had assumed that it had to be Currie in command, and it wasn't, of course. That isn't to say Currie didn't play a key role. He did as a divisional commander. And yet coming out of Vimy, Sir Julian Byng's was rightly seen as having delivered an important victory there, especially within the larger Battle of Arras, which was largely a failure, within the larger Nivelle offensive, which was a clear-cut defeat. Byng is given 3rd British Army. And the question is, who will replace Currie as Corps commander? Sir Douglas Haig, seen in this picture with Currie, initially thought it would be another British general, but Byng suggested it was time for a Canadian to lead. And he said the only Canadian who could do this would be Currie. And Sir Douglas Haig accepted that it would be Currie as commander. But it was a near-run thing because Currie faced political conspirators in England. They were led by Lord Beaverbrook, that wonderful, mischievous gnome, multi-millionaire press baron kingmaker who was stirring up all kinds of trouble. He is a Canadian by birth. And Lord Beaverbrook was tied in closely with Sir Sam Hughes and his son, Garnet Hughes. And they wanted a different general, Sir Richard Turner, as the commander, but the British would not accept that. It had to be Currie. And so Currie was knighted in early of June, and then he received the Corps about 10 days later. But again, it was a near-run thing. And as part of taking over the Corps, and we see Beaverbrook here with Sam Hughes in the middle and Garnet Hughes, the son, who was in fact a friend of Currie, and they had served together in the militia in Victoria before the war. Currie received the Corps, but he refused to accept Garnet Hughes as a divisional commander. So Beaverbrook and the father, Sam Hughes, said, all right, if it's not going to be Turner, then you should take the son. You should take Garnet Hughes. Garnet had served as a brigadier on the Somme, had not done terribly well, was raising the 5th Division in England at this time, and Currie said no. And it was an example of many where Currie displayed moral courage. And this is something that I think you need to understand about Currie. Time and time again, he made the difficult decision when it was not in his best interest. It was surely in his interest to have accepted Garnet Hughes. It would have won over the father, who was a powerful political influence. It would have quieted the those conspiring against him in England. But he said no, because Garnet Hughes was not the right commander. And he was right. And yet he paid the price there. And I think one of the interesting things about Currie, in addition to being morally courageous, is that he was always fighting the war with one eye on the battlefield and one eye backwards to England, where he believed there was a cabal of conspirators, Sam Hughes and Garnet Hughes and Beaverbrook and others. And he tarred as well Sir Richard Turner, which was unfair. Turner always tried to do his best for Currie. He was the chief of staff in England at the time. And it must be said that there are letters from Currie that seem paranoid at times. And I think we have to come to grips with that as well. The only thing I would say to that is that when people are really out to get you, like Sam Hughes was, one is apt to be paranoid. Now, as the new Corps commander, Currie, and we saw this image, Currie fought as part of First British Army under Sir Henry Horne, and the Canadians were given the objective of Lens to capture after Vimy. They had fought across the Douai Plain, and in August they were ordered to capture Lens, which the Germans had been dug into for at least 2 years. To think of the timeline here, of course, the Passchendaele offensive is already raging and has already bogged down in rain and was going nowhere. And so the Canadians were ordered to siphon off German reserves and to stick the Germans in Lens. And Currie was encouraged to attack in a frontal assault. In his first battle as a Corps commander, one would think that he would have taken those orders and tried to implement them. But in fact, he went forward, he studied the battlefield, and he understood that the better operation was to capture Hill 70, a hill to the northwest of the city, which would then draw the Germans out of their defenses. If Vimy is to be encapsulated in the phrase of the tremendous planning and then the biting off of that position, Hill 70 was a step forward in the attack doctrine. Tremendous planning, but bite the position of Hill 70 and then hold it with firepower against German counterattacks. That was the German doctrine. That's what Currie anticipated. He laid his plan forward to General Horne, who sensibly agreed and supported Currie and the Canadians with artillery. But I think it's important that Currie made that crucial mental adjustment, not just of capturing ground, but to kill the enemy. And his plan was a success when the Canadians attacked on the 15th of August. They captured Hill 70. They established hundreds of artillery pieces and machine guns to wait for the counterattack, and it came. The Germans counterattacked 21 times over a 4-day period, and they were torn apart. And it was one of the really few battles on the Western Front where an attacking force, the Canadians, inflicted more casualties on the defenders. There were about 10,000 Canadian casualties, suspect about 15,000 to 20,000 German casualties. And of course, that occurred because the attackers, the Canadians, turned into defenders in defending Hill 70 to create that kill zone, which tore up the Germans. Following the victory at Hill 70, Currie was preparing for another attack to secure Lens because the Germans had not retreated as he'd hoped when he was ordered to the Passchendaele battlefield. Sir Douglas Haig asked for the Canadians to help deliver victory. This was in September, late September. The battlefield had been reduced to a bog of unburied corpses and craters, as we see in the image here. And you, of course, can all conjure up the horrible images of Passchendaele. Currie objected. Again, he showed his moral courage. He appealed to Sir Douglas Haig, saying it wasn't worth it. And yet, even though he was commander of a national army, in this case, the Canadian Corps, he understood he was part of the British Expeditionary Force, and so they went. But he showed moral courage again, and was only overruled after vigorous protest. And again, at Passchendaele, Currie surveyed the grim battlefield. He actually crawled out into the mud, came back, reported on the disastrous conditions of roads, the lack of artillery pieces and ammunition. And he used his influence as a National Army commander to demand more guns, more artillery pieces, and more importantly, 2 weeks to prepare for the battle. And he eventually, the Canadians engaged in 4 set-piece battles at Passchendaele on the 26th of October, where they pulled themselves out of the mud. A second phase on the 30th of October. You can see the map here. Then the 6th of November, which is the green line, where they captured Passchendaele village and what was left of it, and a final attack on the 10th. They were a series of victories, and yet they came at a terrible cost, about 16,000 casualties. And Currie remained very angry over Passchendaele. He wrote in one letter that he felt a great feeling and indignation that men should be put up against such positions to be sacrificed. He felt those casualties, and he felt the weight of Passchendaele. And this partially came to him because there was increasing criticism in Canada about the Canadian casualties at Hill 70 and Passchendaele, led by Sam Hughes, who was stirring up trouble, who at one point accused Canada of Currie of 200,000 casualties at Hill 70. That was twice the entire strength of the Canadian Corps. And yet, back in Canada, Sam Hughes was railing against Currie, who he had now come to hate. Sam Hughes was an egomaniac, an unstable individual, known as a madman. And he had been fired from Borden's government in November of 1916 as a minister. So now he was on the backbenches, where he freely attacked everyone, including his own party. He was a maverick figure. And when I wrote about Sam Hughes in 2010, I didn't know much about Donald Trump, but he has what we might now call many Trumpian qualities of highs and lows and outrageous statements, and perhaps a loose association with the truth. But one of the truths that he began to talk about was, in fact, that Currie had stolen money. Now, Currie had done this. You'll remember in 1914, Currie was bankrupt, and he had joined the war effort by absconding with $10,000 from his regiment. And there's no easy way to explain this. Some historians have tried. It was out of his mind. He was thinking about the war. He was more focused on what was happening. No, he took $10,000 and he didn't repay it. And Sam Hughes knew about this because he was the defense minister, and he threatened to expose Currie. And the government of the day, when they found out about this in late 1917, they were horrified, because Currie was increasingly becoming the icon of the Canadian war effort. And here he was, having pilfered significant resources. Eventually, Currie did pay it back. He had to borrow from some of his subordinate officers, and yet it was a stain on his character. Interestingly, Hughes never publicly came forward with the accusations, even though he could have, and it probably would have destroyed Currie. And that is a difficult thing to understand, because Sam Hughes never saw a belt that he didn't like to punch below. And it would have been well within his keeping, I think, to have accused Currie of this theft. But he didn't. To return to the battlefield, the Canadians limped back to Vimy Ridge in late 1917 and early 1918, and Currie went about fortifying the ridge. He also went through a series of reforms that happened between the winter of, from the Somme to Vimy over the winter of 1916, early 1917. An equally important series of organizations occurred in this early 1918 period. And Currie again led many of the reforms to infantry, to artillery, to more engineers. But the most crucial one, I think, was that Currie, and this happened in the British Army, where the British divisions, were reduced from 12 infantry battalions to 9. It was hoped that the Canadians would follow suit. Their 4 divisions, if they were reduced from 12 infantry battalions to 9, would create 2 new divisions. So it'd be 6 Canadian divisions, which they planned to break into 2 corps, of which Currie would be the army commander. So He was offered this. This came from GHQ, from Haig's headquarters. The Canadians in England wanted to see this happen. It would create a whole number of new divisional and command appointments. And Currie said no. Absolutely shocking to everyone. Why? Well, he said it made no sense. The Canadian Corps was a hard-hitting formation. If it reduced its infantry battalions from 12 to 9, it would lose that striking power. It would dilute the effectiveness of these formations. And he refused to accept this change, even though he was offered an army command and there were no other Dominion army commanders. It took moral courage to do that. And again, it started a whole new series of rumors, some confusing that Currie was feathering his own nest, that he wasn't sharing power. None of that made any sense, but Currie stuck to his guns. And that was probably the most important decision that Currie made during the course of the war. It's not glamorous, but it was crucial to understanding why the Canadians were so effective in the last part of the war. And I think I have about 5 minutes left, and I think I'll just move forward through that. The 100 Days campaign, where the Canadians and the Australians with the British and the French fighting at Amiens, was the beginning of the end. We know the Canadians were not fighting alone, but they engage in a series of crucial battles at Amiens. At the end of August at the Battle of Yrus, then the capture of Cambrai on the 8th of October, which is probably the most important feat the Canadians carry out during the 100 Days, and then the final battles and the capture of Mons. And all of this, the Canadians are engaged in a spearhead role, but taking horrendous casualties. More than 45,000 casualties in the 100 Days. And this weighed heavily on Currie. He talked about those casualties. He talked about writing home to the grieving parents. He wrote this letter. The hardest part of this whole job was having so often to sign the death warrant for a lot of splendid Canadian lives. And that, to me, really sums up the weight that he bore, as did so many other commanders during the war. The idea of the butchers and bunglers in almost all cases is simply false, as we now know 20 or 25 years into the new historiography about the writing of the Great War. And the war ended on November 11th, 1918, as we know, on the Western Front. Is a lovely painting of the Canadians in Mons here. I think I'll end it there with some final commentary. Currie was exhausted by the end of the war. He was working 17-hour days for months on end. He served throughout the war. He was 42 years old at the end of the war. And in his letters, he talked about his wasting health. He talked about his frequent nightmares. His letters for years after the war contain accounts of nightmares, what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, seeing spectral soldiers, feeling the guilt of his command, and yet he understood that it was only through battle and fighting and killing that the war could be won. He understood that contradiction, and yet it wore him down. And this is a painting from early 1919 by William Orpen, the famous British painter who painted Currie at Versailles when Currie was there to offer military advice to the Canadian political delegation. Currie hated this painting. He hated it because he didn't think that Orpen had captured him. He thought he looked like an old man. I think the painting is accurate. Currie was an old man. He was aged by the war far beyond his years. He's 42 years old here. The war wore him down. And I will end with a quotation here and then a final summation. He wrote this about the Canadian Corps accomplishment in the 100 Days, those series of battles where the Canadians met and defeated elements of 47 German divisions. He wrote this of the terrible casualties: "It is truly impossible for me to find words to adequately express the truly wonderful fighting qualities of our men and what they have displayed. I cannot say any more. A lump comes in one's throat whenever you think about it." Now, these victories, the hard-fought victories at the end of the war, came with another cost. And Sir Sam Hughes, who had dogged Currie for the last 2 years, stood up in the House of Commons in March of 1919 and accused Currie of being a butcherer. He accused him of having willfully killed off his own soldiers, having thrown them into battle after battle, having been a British toady who refused to stand up to Canadian rights. It was nonsense, it was mean-spirited, and yet it took hold in the Canadian imagination among some Canadians who were looking for why the casualties had been so high in the war. They did not know of Currie's preparation. They did not know of his reforms. They did not know of what important work he had done on behalf of the Canadian soldiers. And so Currie, when he returned to Canada in 1919, he returned not as a celebrated general, but in fact, one who would have to fight for his reputation, which he would do throughout the 1920s, including a sensational, and I argue the most sensational, court trial of the decade in 1928, where he had to fight for his reputation. 7 years after Sam Hughes was already in the grave, Currie fought that trial, but it destroyed him. He suffered a stroke and he died 5 years later in 1933. His reputation largely restored, and yet never treated, I think, with the full respect that he deserved as Canada's greatest battlefield general. As a final thought, I hope you have a better sense of who Sir Arthur Currie was, what he did, and perhaps why he is important to remember today. While the casualties were horrendous on the Western Front, Currie found ways to win, even as he was accused of being callous with the lives of soldiers. He made mistakes, but he rarely made them twice. And he helped to lead the Canadians on the Western Front, which was a violent sight, but an arena where Canada stepped out onto the world stage. He was a contradiction, but who of us is not? Thanks very much, everyone.
Tim, that was absolutely splendid. Thanks ever so much indeed. If I can perhaps first of all ask for everybody to have a raise your hands virtually as a round of applause for Tim there. I can confirm that there's lots of hands going up there as a round of applause, Tim. So that was thoroughly entertaining and indeed educational. Questions, folks. Now's the time for Q&As. We've got quite a number of questions already, and we don't stand a chance of getting through them all. So let's just crack on and see how many we do get through. Mark Farmer.
My grandfather was DA and QMG of the Canadian Corps, I think from 1916 to 1990. And I just wondered whether that continuity was unusual, and also my own little family myth, that he was one of the few people in the First World War who actually reached the level of his ability and didn't get over promoted. Maybe a bit of a controversial thought, but he was bloody good at his job by the sound of it. And had he gone further, he might have overstretched himself. It's just a thought. But did Arthur Currie rely on people like him? Was he able to rely on people like him?
Yeah, and how nice to meet you. Farmer is of course one of the great staff officers in the Canadian Corps, one of the many British and Imperials who really guided the Canadians forward. And there's a terrific series of studies by Doug Delaney, if anyone is interested in this, who has written about this, an academic article, I believe, in the Journal of Military History, but also a recent book, I think, called The Imperial Army Project, which explores some of these issues and the importance there. There was a nationalizing movement throughout the war to look at the battalion commanders and brigade commanders and divisional commanders, and you can see Canadians taking over more important roles. But in the nationalizing idea of the Canadian Corps, this idea that the Corps represented Canada and that Canada was forever changed by the war, often those British staff officers have been written out of our history in the past. And I think in a more recent scholarship in the last 10 years, there's a greater understanding of the continuity that those staff officers brought to the Canadian Corps to help tie into the BEF and other formations. But I think also without suggesting that the Canadian Corps was the same as every other unit. It wasn't. It had unique characteristics. And I think finding that balance between what was unique about the Canadians and yet what was similar to the rest of the British corps or divisions is an important area of scholarship that we're still trying to sort out.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Mark. Right, next up, Robin Sanderson. Robin.
I've got a grandfather who was there also in the war there. He was in City St. Auguste on Hill 70, in charge of the Australian tunnellers. And they went over, I think, Bois Hugo in detachments with the 2nd Canadians. And my question basically is, I know that he had a good relation, I know that Haig wanted him to take Currie to take Lens, and he stood up to him, and which was admirable because it was just impossible. It was the greatest, the first fight in a built-up area. My question is, Sir John Monash, another Dominion commander, did Currie have any? What was his relationship with Monash, do you think?
They knew each other and they met a few times during the war, most importantly at the Battle of Amiens on the 8th of August, 1918, where they had to coordinate some of their operations through the army commander. They seem to have respected each other, but I was hoping to find more in Currie's archives. I would love to have seen letters back and forth, but they don't seem to have communicated much. Two thoughts perhaps on this. One, Monash was treated much better by the Australians after the First World War, in my regard. And two, there has always been this really interesting story that Sir Douglas Haig, Lloyd George, in perhaps hoping to fire or get rid of Sir Douglas Haig, would have appointed Currie and Monash as some sort of a duo, a Ludendorff-Hindenburg type thing. There doesn't appear to be any evidence that that's true at all. And I think it's worthy to say that Monash and Currie were respected by Haig, but there were 5 army commanders above them who would have been next to go up. And it simply would not have occurred for 2 Dominion Corps commanders to somehow command the BEF. So let's put that aside. That isn't true.
Joffre did command the Allies, didn't he, later on, which is interesting. That did happen.
Yeah, there are interesting connections, but I think it is fair to say that there was respect for both Monash and Currie.
I'll just add that it was interesting that the Australians took over the tunnel at Hill 60, which the Canadians had started. So just an interesting point. Thank you.
Yeah. John Azar. John.
Great, thank you. Hi, Tim. So how much scope was there for brigade and division generals to shine? And how did the Canadian generals do at that level? And what was their relationship like with working under Currie?
I think the change from the Somme to Vimy, we see the experience of the officer corps. And this will continue throughout the war until by 1918, most of the junior officers have at least 2 years of experience. Majors and lieutenant colonels, if I have those numbers correct. So they're an experienced group, and the same is true for the divisional commanders. The Canadians had some weaker divisional commanders at the start, but they were killed or they were removed. They didn't have a chance to progress forward. And I think by the end of the war, it's a very strong group of divisional commanders. I do think that they all imprinted their leadership and their art of command on their division. So each of the divisions is actually quite different too, often reflecting their commanders. And we know that from the scholarship with regards to British divisions, that a GOC can have a tremendous impact on the culture and the ethos.
And the relationships with Currie? of the senior leaders?
Generally positive. I think of MacDonnell of the 1st Division, Baddie Mack, as he was known, a fiery commander, very close to Currie. Less so for Burstall, the 2nd Division commander, who was permanent force. 3rd Division went through a number of divisional commanders, most of them close. And David Watson is the 4th, who was the weakest Canadian commander, but he's the one who lent Currie the money to pay back his debt. So again, in the stress and strain of battle, there were few overt breaks, save for maybe one case. And I think it's generally a coherent and strong group of senior officers.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, John, for your question there. Next up, David Pitcher. David, do you want to just unmute yourself there?
My great uncle, Granville Cusack, was fighting today, taking the Pimple. And the war diary says that the visibility due to the snowstorm was only 20 or 30 yards. How much did the trench raids and planning make a difference to the success on Vimy Ridge? I should point out my grandfather was killed in the trench raid on the 13th of Feb, which is why I've got this accent and not yours. Thank you.
The Canadians launched 60 raids in the 3 months before Vimy, an astonishing number, almost every single night, to the point where General Currie said, we're doing too many of these. This is no longer bringing the intelligence we need, and in fact, it's killing off our best NCOs and junior officers. So there was a balance there. And if you're interested in other reading, one of my former students, Colin Garnet, published a really good article on trench raiding in Canadian Military History. That's a journal. It's online at Laurier University. And there's 30 years of articles there. I'm looking at Angus Brown here, another Canadian. I believe Angus has published there. Bill's published 4 or 5 articles. I've published a dozen articles. It's a great place to get some history. And there's at least 2-3 good articles on pre-Vimy raiding there that you may want to check out. And anyone else?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Next man, Mark Cutting. Mark, unmute yourself there, please.
Yes, I think actually my question has been partially asked. If it's okay, I'll slightly twist it. But I was asking if Monash and Currie, how connected were they? But I also note that, Currie, Monash, obviously Haig, Foch were all dead within a very similar time span after the war. And sort of you have this explosion of sort of proto-national feeling amongst Australia, New Zealand and Canada. And, and how much that allowed, the fact that these men were no longer allowed to speak for themselves, that, of course, no one doubts the bravery of Canadian, Australian troops. And I think from a big picture, all people can see that they had a tremendous performance. And so any criticism of those commanders was difficult to be countered, partly because they were all, I think, probably as the stress of the war and of the job they did, dead. But there were similarities between Australia and Canada, and I think less so, but also New Zealand, in how, because they were not around, the story and the myth of the war got twisted. But actually, and I just wondered if you had any sort of thoughts on that, because I think it sometimes has shrouded the fantastic performance of the Canadian troops, the criticism of Monash.
It's a great question, Mark. And in the case of Currie, I mean, it's astonishing that I believe he's the only senior general who comes back and is, with the label of being a murderer of his own soldiers. I mean, it was a really astonishing charge, and it rocked Canadians because it was only 4 months after the end of the war. Canadians were just starting to come home. They hadn't yet begun the commemorative impulse of building the thousands of memorials across the country, although that was part of the story. And here is this charge that Currie has been killing his own soldiers, shocking in every way, and that the government of the day did not stand up to defend Currie until 10 days later. Just added to a bit of the intrigue, and it pushed the rumor mill. I mean, in the absence, as we now know in this post-truth era, without proper communication, someone will fill it. And there were legitimate questions. I mean, 66,000 Canadian dead in the war, if you include those who die in the immediate aftermath. who is to blame? That's a lot. People wanted answers. And I think that's a part of it. And then I think to the core of your question of as the generals die and what happens to the memory, and 10 years later and the 1929 generation, the study of memory from Jay Winter and Brian Bond and Jonathan Vance in Canada, and I suppose myself and others. It's a complex story about Canada, and I don't think we can answer it here, but I'll suggest if people are interested, I wrote a book called Cleo's Warriors, which is on the writing of Canadian military history and the failure to write our history. Jonathan Vance's Death So Noble is very important, and I suppose I'll plug my Vimy book, which looks at the evolving memory of the war over time. Except to say that memory and commemoration and the relevance of the Great War, we know changes from generation to generation, and we know that it disappears in the 50s and 60s and comes back in the 60s as something quite different again. And then we know the butchers and bunglers story, and then the new military history from, call it the late 1990s or so. Maybe it's interesting for this well-read group to think about where is the next generation going? I mean, I think the idea of the learning curve is probably, we need to go in other places. So where will new scholars be pushing battlefield studies? There's a whole lot of studies of people looking at social, culture, gender, home front commemoration, memory, veterans, women, children, the elderly, the list goes on. Where are the new studies going? And what will the next generation tackle?
Can I just follow up with a question about the divisions in the Corps? Do you think it was a mistake or correct for Currie to resist the reduction in the Canadian in the battalions from 12 to 9? I mean, obviously, it became a much stronger corps and very powerful, but it obviously didn't fit with the rest of Haig's command.
It's a good question, David, and I think it's a complex answer, so I'll try to offer it. Is that it was certainly beneficial to the Canadian Corps to keep the 4 overstrength divisions. Now, and part of this contributes to the Canadian reputation of being shock troops, right, of being the spearhead. Well, we never say that really comparing British divisions to Canadian divisions is like apples to oranges, because the Canadians are a lot heavier in infantry, so they can absorb more punishment, but in fact, they can do other things. I mean, when you have 3 strong brigades, each of 4 strong battalions, you can actually keep them in the line more often. You can engage in different tactics. And I think it was successful. I think for Currie, it would have been better for him if he was an army commander. I mean, he would not only be known in Canada, but I think he would be known throughout the British Empire, the British Commonwealth, right? He really would have been something quite unique. And I think we have to understand that Currie understood what he was doing when he was turning that down. And I come back to this idea of being morally brave. He did the right thing for the Canadians, for the Canadian Corps. And the backstory here is that there was a conscription crisis in Canada at the same time. He understood this, that we didn't have unlimited men, and yet he probably didn't do the right thing for himself.
Super. Thanks for that full answer. Anthony, do you want to unmute yourself there?
Yeah. Just a very general question. What was the makeup of the Canadian Corps? I mean, and how many Canadians were first generation Canadians?
Well, the great trick of Canadian national writers is to talk about the Canadian Corps as this great national movement and organization, but about half of the Canadians were British born, and they were all British subjects. And we have fairly detailed breakdowns of the demographics of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, which by the end of the war is about 51% Canadian born. But I suspect the Canadian Corps itself has a higher number of British born in it. Those are the stats and the numbers. What we make of them, how you interpret them matter. If you came to Canada from Scotland in 1896 and you enlisted in the CEF at 34 years old, were you Canadian or Scottish? Well, I think that there's a fluidity of identity, not to break into gobbledygook academic talk here, but, you know, people are more than one thing, all right? We are, everyone at the core is a British subject. There are Canadian born, there are other born, there are at least 40,000 Americans in the CEF, and we now think maybe closer to 60,000. That's quite astonishing. You can find every race and nationality in the Canadian Corps. So it's a really good question. I think in a broad sweeping terms, the Canadian Corps has a very large number of British-born soldiers. When you begin to think about officers and enlisted men, it's different. There's far more Canadian born in the officer corps, and during the war it changes and all kinds of things. But it's a good study, and maybe it reminds us again of the balance between the national forces, the Australians, the New Zealanders, the Newfoundlanders, if we think of a smaller one, which all are, you know, emerge from the war with a stronger sense of identity, but still within the British Empire. I mean, nobody is looking for independence here, putting aside Ireland maybe. So there is something quite powerful about the British Empire and the British Empire at war that survives the First World War, even as there are other nationalizing movements that are a result of the war.
Super. Thanks for that. Thanks for your question, Anthony. Campbell.
Thank you, David. Why do you think that there was dead silence in Parliament after Sam Hughes gets up and makes that awful speech? You know, nobody jumps to Arthur Currie's defense right away. And you know, it's always surprised me about that. And I wonder, was Prime Minister Robert Borden even in the House that day?
He was not. And he was, because this was the 4th of March, 1919. So Borden, I think, is still at Versailles, as are a number of other senior ministers. It's a great question, and it's troubling, you know, and there are many aspects to it. So Hughes makes this outrageous charge, and then they break for lunch, if I remember correctly. So there's a kind of, it was almost like that no one could jump back in, but no one seemed to want to jump back in for a number of reasons. One, Sam Hughes was scary. He was a scary guy. He was a battler his whole life. He loved to get into arguments in the House of Commons. And so he was a formidable force. He's sometimes been reduced to a clown or a buffoon. He had clownish qualities and buffoonish qualities, but he was not a clown or a buffoon. He was a very skilled parliamentary debater, and of the roughest and toughest kind. Two, Sam Hughes had 50 years of militia experience. He was the former defense minister. He was one of the most experienced members of the House of Commons. And so his words did carry weight. Three, and I think this is important, the Borden ministers were aware of Currie's embezzlement, even though it had been paid back. And that seems to have weighed on them. And then four, and this is important too, is that Currie was a nobody to them. He had risen from a real estate developer in Victoria to the Corps commander and you know, Canada's face of the war effort. And yet he had almost no political backers. And I think we know what happens when generals do not have political backers. They tend to get a knife in their back. In this case, it was in his chest. And it wasn't until 10 days later where one of Currie's officers, Peck, also from Victoria, aware of the Victoria Cross, stood up and put Sam Hughes in his place. And he eviscerated him in his takedown.
Beautiful.
And it is worthy of reading if you can. The House of Commons debates are all online. I think it's in my book. I think it was about 10 days later, so it'd be around the 14th, and it will warm your heart to see the defense of Currie. And yet the problem is that once these toxic words get out there, you can't bring them back. And Currie, for the next 10 years, is always figuring out how to refute the charges without looking like a man desperate to refute the charges.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question. Well, there's stacks more questions, but it's now 10 to 10 UK time, and obviously it's not quite as late in Canada, but we've held it you're long enough here. I'm very pleased that you mentioned Cyrus Peck there. I mean, that's the one character probably in the Canadian Expeditionary Force that makes Arthur Currie look slim. And it's also interesting that there's an article on the WFA website about Cyrus Peck's proclivity for the bagpipes, and the tactical use of bagpipes in an attack is perhaps a subject for another discussion later on. But gentlemen, that's been thoroughly enjoyable and entertaining, and I'd invite everybody who's viewing this to raise your hands as a virtual round of applause one final time for Tim, who've really entertained us this evening. Needless to say that these webinars continue just once a week now. We're just reducing the numbers to once a week as spring's in the air, and hopefully we're coming out of lockdown. So if you haven't registered for the April webinars and you wish to do so, I'm sorry, it's too late, simply because they're all full. But you can continue to watch us on Facebook, and anybody who's watching us on Facebook, you're more than welcome to do so. It would be great if people who are watching us on Facebook would like to join the Western Front Association. It's extremely good value for money, and you get lots of benefits for joining us. I'm going to stop blathering now because I realise I am doing, and thank you again from the bottom of my heart for your work tonight. It's been thoroughly entertaining and thoroughly educational.
Thank you, David. Thanks for all your hard work as well.
Well, on that note, thanks very much everybody for watching, and good night.
Mademoiselle from Armitage, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armitage, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armitage, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Inky, pinky, parlez-vous. Out on Kinkid Armitage, parlez-vous. Out on Kinkid Armitage, parlez-vous. Out on Kinkid Armitage, broke the spell of 40 years. Inky, pinky, parlez-vous. The officers get on